All right, hello and welcome to the Dutch United Nations Student Association, SIB-Groningen. Thank you all for joining us this evening. It's bound to be an exciting lecture and hopefully a fun discussion afterwards if you all stick around in the Zoom call. If you'd rather not, there's always the Zoom live stream on YouTube. And yeah, this lecture, our first lecture of 2021, has been organized by Dispute Mancala. They had a different lecture lined up originally, but when some issues happened, we decided to change it last minute to this new, quite exciting topic after last week's developments, which I'm sure everyone knows about in depth. And yeah, I hope everyone enjoys it. I hope it'll be a good talk, and that we'll have some good intellectual stimulation from it afterwards. And yeah, now I'll just hand over the words to Dispute Mancala to introduce today's speaker, tell you a bit more about what will be discussed this evening. Yeah, so without further ado, please, Margarita, go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me? Okay. So, yeah, it is our great pleasure to introduce Professor Bharath Ganesh, who is Assistant Professor of Media Studies at the University of Groningen. And Bharath is a political geographer who has used computational and qualitative methods to study new media, political communication, and far-right cultures online. And before joining the University of Groningen, he was a postdoctoral researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute of the University of Oxford. And this project focused on social media manipulation and disinformation in North America and Western Europe, as well as studies of the digital culture of the radical far right as part of the Vox Poll network. And in 2020, Bharath's publications included a study on how the alt-rights weaponize the rage of online audiences. And this really resonates with last week's news from the US. So I will now give the floor to Professor Bharath Ganesh. Thank you for being with us on such short notice.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that introduction, and thanks to all of you for having me and paying attention to a lecture on Monday night in between all of the other lectures I think you probably have to pay attention to. And yeah, so what we're going to talk about today is I'll have a presentation about some of the, about what happened last week in terms of the storming of the Capitol. I've got some slides, but since it's a pretty relatively small group, I think it would be great if you want to just jump in with questions. I don't really feel like this needs to be like a proper kind of lecture. We can break it up with questions as we go. Just to get started, as Margarita mentioned, I've recently published an article at the start of this year about how the far right and far right politicians like Donald Trump, but not just him alone, weaponize hate, and specifically more how they weaponize emotions. And I'm going to talk about what that means in the presentation. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about today, is really kind of built off of that. But before we get into it, I want to let you know that actually most of that analysis kind of comes from work I was doing in 2017, 2018, and that's just the lag it takes to get things published. But as all of you've probably noticed, this is an extremely fast-moving field, right? Nobody probably expected that in the first 2 weeks of 2021, this would have happened with the storming of the Capitol, but then also all of the kinds of things like taking down Trump's account from Twitter and Facebook, and taking down the right-wing website Parler and all of these. So one of the things here is that I'm going to talk to you about this through the lens of my research, which focuses on the far right more in general. But there's a lot of discussions now about all these different kinds of smaller groups within the far right, like QAnon, for example. And honestly, it's moving so fast that it's really hard to be able to even give you an overview of what's going on. So anyway, let me get into, with those kind of caveats in mind, let me get into the presentation and load up my, my slides here. Okay, so if we can begin, so what I'm going to talk about is obviously this event, storming the Capitol, but I really want to focus on giving all of you some context and sort of what kinds of trends and patterns we can kind of understand coming out of this. And more, I want to think about what is it that got us to this point, because this didn't happen in a vacuum. As I said, nobody probably expected what was going to happen in the first 2 weeks of this year. But at the same time, plenty of us have been warning that something like this was going to happen. Nobody could have predicted exactly what it was, but something like this was in the works for quite some time, right? And there's been this kind of use, particularly of digital media, to help this, to keep this kind of bubbling, and now it's really boiled over as we've seen. So I'm going to try to talk through a little bit about the context and the background to this event. So I think the best place to start here in terms of trying to understand what happened when Donald Trump got elected is, I think, this quote from Toni Morrison, a Nobel Prize winning author, and I think she passed away last year or maybe late 2019. But in the New Yorker, she wrote a really brilliant piece that talked about what it is that she felt was going on in the United States and what it is that Trump's election represented. And what Toni Morrison says is this in her article. I think this is the most important quote there. She writes, "In America today, post-civil rights legislation, white people's conviction of their natural superiority is being lost, rapidly lost. There are people of color everywhere threatening to erase this long understood definition of America. And what then? Another Black president, a predominantly Black Senate, 3 Black Supreme Court justices." What Morrison, I think, is saying here, and I think what's really important, is that she's talking about how Donald Trump's election is part of a really long process about race in America after World War II, right? So obviously there was Jim Crow and segregation in the United States immediately after World War II. But after the civil rights era, in which Black people were granted the right to vote and a lot of significant protections and legislation made to ensure equality had been advanced, there is what I think Morrison is trying to point to, is that there's this sense in which a particular group that had been structurally dominant in the United States, and that's primarily white Americans, if we're more specific, also middle class and upper class white Americans, had lost their sense of what Morrison refers to as natural superiority, right? But more than natural, it's really the idea that the state itself and the government and the society that we lived in had more privileges accruing to people based on the color of their skin. Now, this is a story that anyone who's kind of watched America in the last few years or decades really would know. But I think what we need to learn, particularly from this lesson, is that Morrison is pointing to a much broader phenomenon, which we might refer to as white backlash. And we can see this popping up and developing in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. But it really came to a head after Barack Obama was elected in 2008. And what we saw at that point was the emergence of the Tea Party and a lot of new kinds of configurations of racist politics in the United States. And a lot of it was really grounded in this reaction against the recognition of the rights and equalities of people of color. So there's, in the kind of more broadly in the literature, there's a broader discussion, if you look into work in sociology about conservatism, this kind of claim about white backlash. And another thing that that was recently published, I think back now in 2018, in the journal Sociology of Religion, was that not talking about far-right people, but just talking about the people who voted for Donald Trump, perhaps the most salient variable that explains why they voted for Donald Trump was the sense of losing what made America America, and particularly the sense of trying to advance and retain a white Christian America. And these kinds of racial mythologies now are really what animate what's going on when we're looking at what happens in terms of storming the Capitol. So what I want to start with really is this problem. When we're talking about what's going on here, this is fundamentally, I would say, an issue about race, and it's an issue about power in the United States. And that's what I think has really boiled over. And Donald Trump obviously has been using race and racism constantly as a way to win votes. And the point is that it has worked for him. So I want to explain a little bit more about what these ideas mean. Now, I told you a little bit about a general picture. So now I want to come into a more specific picture. And this is the specific picture about the far right today, and particularly what you can refer to as the so-called alt-right, which is kind of a loose network and coalition of a variety of different kinds of extreme ideologies, ranging from kind of rabid anti-feminism to kind of belief that conspiratorial beliefs that cultural Marxists, which is of course a anti-Semitic code word for Jews, are running the world, to this idea that I'm going to talk about now, which is the idea of white genocide and demographic threats. So what we've seen kind of develop, especially just before Donald Trump came into office, so sort of in the 2016 election, and then moving forward in the years after that, is the emergence of this idea of the red pill. Now, I'm sure all of you have watched the film The Matrix. If you haven't, you really should, because it is a really good movie. It has nothing really to do with the far right. But in it, the main character of the film, Neo, is asked to take either a red pill or a blue pill, right? From Morpheus, who's this character who's going to show Neo the truth. And the truth, of course, being that all humans are actually in a computer simulation and are essentially being grown and harvested by robots. Now, that's the film, of course. But the idea is that if Neo takes the red pill, then he will be awakened to this truth. And if Neo takes the blue pill, then he'll stay in his life of ignorance. So obviously in the film, Neo takes the red pill and then learns the truth about the world at that time in the Matrix. Now, the idea of the red pill has been kind of appropriated by the far right, and particularly it's been a key trope for the alt-right. And it actually comes from male supremacist organizing online and male supremacist communities online. So the idea was that if you were red-pilled, you would be awakened to the ways in which feminists were actually being able to control men. There's a lot more to it than that, but I don't really want to get into all of this. I'm happy to drop some references if you want to read more about it. Now, So the idea of this red pill was about being awakened to all of the ways in which feminism was trying to control men, right? And the alt-right kind of took hold of this idea and then transformed it into the idea of being awakened to what's happening to Western identity. And of course, when they say Western identity, they're really talking about white identity. Because if you look into the ideologies of the far right, they really only recognize that if you want to belong in a particular community, you have to be genetically and fundamentally rooted in that territory, right? So that means that a French person can only claim Frenchness if they were born in France to French parents and can trace genetically that the truth of their kind of Frenchness. Now, that broader ideology kind of comes together in this red pill mythology, where it's basically that the idea is that because of globalization, because of these other kind of conspiratorial ideas like cultural Marxism, et cetera, we've all been brainwashed into thinking that diversity and multiculturalism are good things. And so the idea is that you take the red pill and then you become awoken, not just to the fact that feminism is controlling all of the men in the world, but also that the governments and the elites in our society are forcing multiculturalism upon us, and it's going to be detrimental to our societies. Now, the red pill is sort of tightly integrated with this broader mythology of white genocide. And the idea here is that there's this rampant fear and conspiratorial belief that migrants to Europe and migrants to the United States are creating a demographic threat to the point in which white people will become a minority in what they consider their own countries, right? So the idea behind the white genocide mythology is basically that multiculturalism, diversity, and simply recognizing the political rights of non-white people or people with a different religion is a threat to white people at large. Now, this is obviously a big racist conspiracy theory, right? But the idea is that, it kind of comes through in a lot of these discussions about immigration, about diversity, and about a lot of the kind of issues and controversies that we have in multicultural societies in terms of how we live together across difference. But here, this is really an extreme ideology in which there's a firm belief that white people are physically and demographically under threat, and drastic action needs to be taken in order to stop that from accelerating. So I'm going to give you some examples of kind of how this plays out. And I think the sort of right metaphor to use to try to make sense of this is this idea of a networked structure of feeling. And so these are some pictures that I used that I collected from Twitter some time ago. Nowadays, you'll probably not find this kind of stuff on Twitter because of the content moderation now. But what you have is what I've referred to in some of my writing as a sense of synthetic white victimhood, right? Because it's synthetic in the sense that it's not real, it's invented. And the way that it's invented is through these decentralized kind of what I refer to as swarms of users on social media platforms that migrate all over the internet and try to present kind of evidence of these sorts of conspiracy theories. Now, so there's three images here. So on the left is a Nazi piece of Nazi propaganda, which has this kind of image of people of African descent looking down at French people in what looks to be an exhibit or a zoo. And there's the idea is that this is what France is going to look like in 100 years. Right, so this is a really racist and extremist piece of propaganda, but it really kind of shows what it is that the extreme right and the alt-right, for example, is trying to awaken people to being aware of. One of the ways they do that is through this meme, I guess, in the middle here, where you've got all of these different beauty pageant winners from different European and Western countries, plus Australia. And every single one of them, of course, is a Black woman. And all it says here is, why? And then in the tweet, it actually says something incredibly weird is going on in the West, right? And here the implication is there's no way that a Black woman could ever represent beauty in a Western country, right? So again, we see this kind of sense in which migrants and people from other parts of the world coming into Europe, coming into North America, are actually presenting a threat. And I think on the right is what you get, which is the most kind of common sort of image and has been prolific on social media for years and years, which is what we have is an image of a market outside, outdoor market in a British city. And here you've got a picture of visibly Muslim women in the foreground. And you have this, the text alongside it says, mass immigration is the end of Britain. Please retweet to wake people up. Now, of course, you're not going to see mainstream politicians posting Nazi propaganda like what's on the left, right? But the one in the middle and the one on the right, this is more and more the kind of normal discourse that we see when it comes to looking at the far right and bleeding into quite a lot of the mainstream right today. Now, one of the ways in which we can try to think about this is what Arlie Hochschild describes as a deep story. And she develops this kind of idea of a deep story by talking to a number of people in different parts of the United States. I think most of her ethnographic work was done, I want to say in Louisiana, but off the top of my head, I can't quite remember. But one of the points that she makes is that there's a sense that people have of this deep story in which the prism through which they understand the world is sort of framed through this deep story. And what I want to suggest is essentially that the red pill and the white genocide are kind of the deep stories that help to animate the far right. Hochschild writes, "You are a stranger in your own land. You don't recognize yourself in how others see you. It is a struggle to feel seen and honored. And to feel honored, you have to feel and feel seen as moving forward. But through no fault of your own, and in ways that are hidden, you are slipping backwards." Later on in this deep story, in which Hochschild is basically trying to render back to her interviewees how she thinks they see the world, they talk about the ways in which they see immigrants and African Americans as cutting the line in front of them as they're moving forward to achieve that kind of elusive myth of the American dream. And so there's this idea that Hochschild kind of brings up in her work, which is that there's this sense that migrants and more generally diversity and multiculturalism in general is taking away not only just the privileges that white people in the United States and Europe have enjoyed for many years and decades in our societies, but actually that now they're being pushed to the back of the line. And this is one of the kind of key themes that keeps coming up. Now, I think one of the ways to frame this is this terminology of white backlash. And so that's what I'm going to try to discuss here. And again, now what we're doing is, what I'm trying to do is draw some threads between this kind of set of feelings that people have, right, that are sort of stoked by media, and then how the alt-right actually tries to weaponize this idea of white backlash in order to create kind of, not only just to promote politicians like Donald Trump, but also to just increase their influence and their visibility online in order to spread their ideologies with the goal of trying to red pill people. So I'm just going to talk about a few of these pictures. So in the middle, there's a tweet by Paul Joseph Watson where he's referring to a songwriter, Lily Allen, based on this kind of like longer thread of discussion going on in the United Kingdom about what's referred to pejoratively as Muslim grooming gangs, which is the idea that, I mean, it's true that there have been grooming gangs of men who've been involved in organized crime and organized sexual exploitation of young women. And most of those men are in certain places and at certain times are Pakistani men. Now, the far right wanted to turn this into a religion issue, right? And obviously, the number of Muslims in the UK is quite huge, and the vast majority, the idea that they're all implicated in this is total nonsense. However, what you get is this kind of construction of Muslim grooming gangs, which is one of the ways in which these kinds of issues get discussed, and how multiculturalism gets discussed amongst kind of key influencers for the far right. So Lily Allen here is saying, she's trying to make the point that a lot of these young girls who were caught up in this child sexual exploitation and this organized crime, she's saying that there's a strong possibility that they would have faced domestic violence or sexual abuse at some point, right? And Lily Allen is simply trying to make the point that a huge proportion of women in the United Kingdom. Anyway, so kind of back to the story about Lily Allen. So the point here that Paul Joseph Watson is trying to make is he's trying to basically accuse Lily Allen of supporting these groups, and he says, "Oh, this is completely mental," right? And so what we have here is actually so Lily Allen was trolled by another friend of Paul, well, I don't know if they're friends, but another kind of fellow traveler in this swarm trolled Lily Allen. She then responded to it, and then Paul Joseph Watson kind of turns it into this big event because he has such a huge following. So that's one of the ways in which this kind of idea about white backlash kind of can play out in concrete ways, places like Twitter. Moving down to this tweet at the bottom here with this young woman, Mark Collette, who is a fascist activist in the United Kingdom, wrote, "This is Sarah. She was killed by Muslim terrorists because politicians care more about diversity and immigration than they do about our safety." So this is in reference to the London Bridge attack in 2017 in the UK. Now, again, this is kind of coming back to this idea that, going back to this kind of white genocide idea in which diversity and immigration are what's threatening people, right? And it's about really trying to reinforce that myth through what I'm kind of referring to as this kind of common symbolic repertoire. And this has the effect of bringing together a pretty diverse and fragmented far right around particular kinds of ideas and around issues. Now, the last thing I'll describe here is the tweet in the top right by Donald Trump, where he says, "People are proud to be saying Merry Christmas again. I am proud to have led the charge against the assault of our cherished and beautiful phrase, Merry Christmas." And so here, of course, Trump is attacking those who would say Happy Holidays instead of Merry Christmas in order to be more inclusive. So again, you see Donald Trump is also trying to play into this kind of broader kind of discourse of white backlash. Now, that's just one of many possible examples, but this is just to give you kind of a flavor for what I'm talking about when I refer to white backlash. So it's hard to kind of understand exactly what the far right is today, right? It's not like one organization that you kind of belong to, but it's hundreds and hundreds of different kinds of users and groups, and it's prolific in terms of all of the different kinds of ways in which those groups split up and have kind of battles between one another. But at the end of the day, you can sort of put them under one kind of broader umbrella. And I use the term digital hate culture really to try to explain this. And so I'm moving away from this kind of idea of like, we're talking about sort of static groups, but actually a very dynamic kind of swarm of users or network of users that come together around particular kinds of events. Now, I've put the image here of the rifle used by Brenton Tarrant, the terrorist who killed more than 50 people at mosques in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019. And in it, what you actually have on this rifle are imagery and symbols and a lot of text that actually refers to a lot of the kind of extreme myths and discussions happening with the far right online. So in a way, like all of these online discussions kind of find their way into kind of reality in the sense that it's kind of articulated through a particular kind of physical incident that happens not offline, but in an actual attack. So you have, for example, the name Alexandre Bissonnette, who was a terrorist that was arrested in Canada. You've got right on the barrel of the weapon, it says "Refugees, welcome to hell." Elsewhere, it says "Remove kebab," which is again another kind of like kind of within sort of the alt-right's world, kind of this refrain about removing and killing Muslims. So a lot of these kinds of mythologies that I've been talking about through these a few different examples, we can kind of see kind of articulated on this weapon. And that's the point at which digital hate culture flows into kind of real world violent harms. But that's not to suggest that, you know, toxicity and hatred online doesn't have its own kind of inherent harms. What we've also seen in the last few years, and this fits in with this idea about white backlash and also white victimhood, is this kind of weaponization of freedom of speech. And so what you have on the left here is 9 different kind of, at the time, relatively well-known far-right influencers across kind of the alt-right and the counter-jihad and anti-Muslim activists in the UK, as well as identitarian activists in Western Europe as well. And so this was a kind of an image that they set up for a march called Day for Freedom. And more what we're seeing is that the far right is trying to articulate what it's doing as advancing the freedom of speech, trying to advance fascist and extremist and racist ideas and laundering them through this idea of actually trying to be like fitting in with sort of the liberal norms of our society. So one of the kind of key figures in sort of the alt-right alternative media world, of course, is Steve Bannon. And this is when, on the right here, is when he's giving a speech, I think, to the National Front in France. And he says to the National Front, says, "Let them call you racists, let them call you xenophobes, let them call you nativists, wear it as a badge of honor." So here, really, freedom of speech is becoming more and more this kind of idea that, oh, the far right claims that we are the real victims because we're not actually being able to articulate our ideas, which of course is nonsense, right? Breitbart, which was partly Steve Bannon's brainchild, is still running. Lauren Southern, who's in the top left of that image on the left, as far as I checked, still has a YouTube account. So does Brittany Pettibone, who's a person at the bottom there. In the middle, in the bottom, in the third row in the middle is Rahim Kassam, who's a far-right journalist who used to work for Breitbart London. He's still got his platform. So again, it's a false narrative. It's really important to stress that. There's no evidence really that conservatives are facing more censorship than anybody else, or that the censorship is not warranted. But what we're seeing more and more is that kind of the ideas about freedom of speech are coming up as kind of the key thing that many far-right people are trying to defend. And this is really effective in terms of trying to reach out to more mainstream audiences. This also, of course, egged on in political communication. And here I'm talking about political communication in a very narrow sense of the stuff that politicians say to their audiences. So that's a narrow sense of what the term political communication means. So you have on the left here an example of Donald Trump kind of directly engaging with the alt-right's meme culture and the sort of rendition of him as Pepe the Frog. In the middle, you have Nigel Farage, who, of course, is one of the main architects of the Brexit campaign's discourse, which was virulently anti-Muslim and racist. And then, of course, you have Boris Johnson, now the Prime Minister of the UK, who often compared women in burqas to letterboxes and has made a variety of references to Black people in racist ways, for example, referring to them as having watermelon smiles. So again, these things get egged on and built up by politicians. And I think that's really what we saw happening last week. So this is now the kind of theoretical piece that I want to propose here. So what we have sort of in the middle here is this kind of culture of white backlash that I've been talking about. And it's got kind of two key practices, right? The first is claiming victimhood. And the second one is transgression. And what I mean by transgression is really about kind of saying certain kinds of things that try to attack certain kinds of taboos, to say things that are not normally acceptable in public discourse, to try to shift what's actually sayable. And some people refer to this as moving the Overton window, which is the idea of moving the boundaries of what acceptable discourse in the media is towards a particular set of ideologies, or to try to make certain kinds of claims acceptable to say in the media. What we're talking about when I'm talking about white backlash is a global community, a discursive community, and a racist subculture. And like I said, I've referred to it as digital hate culture, which kind of brings together the swarm of male supremacists, racists, and anti-government kinds of groups. And it's really connected with this bigger alternative media ecosystem, right? So One American News Network is one example of this alternative media. Breitbart, of course, is another. But there's hundreds of these little outlets now that you can see if you just go on Twitter now. You'll see loads of these different kinds of these alternative media groups. And what they do is they really kind of push out a lot of disinformation. They push out a lot of falsehoods, which then kind of comes back in terms of trying to help mobilize people. And of course, this kind of idea about white backlash has also been connected with these intellectual projects that are common to populist radical right and right-wing extremism. So what you have is that this culture of white backlash reinforces the populist radical right. And when I'm talking about the populist radical right, I'm talking about specific kinds of politicians who make claims on behalf of the people, in order to, and against certain kinds of elites. And when we're talking about the populist radical right, we're really talking about the use of racist and quite often male supremacist discourse in order to kind of articulate a particular we that's under attack. And of course, when it comes to North America and Western Europe, the sense is, of course, of white people being the us that someone like Donald Trump will speak for. So again, when we're talking about the populist radical right, we're talking about primarily social movements and political parties. For them, using social media is really important to kind of circumvent and criticize mainstream media and get those disinformation narratives out there. They then draw on these narratives of white backlash in their political communication. And what it does is actually reinforces and validates that original culture of the kind of broader sensation and the emotions of white backlash that people have. Now, once that process happens, that kind of connective process between the populist radical right, or really the radical right in power, in politics, and then this culture that's formed around this experience and emotional kind of complex of white backlash, we see that these two things kind of work together. And through that, we see the kind of inspiration for extreme forms of mobilization. So not least, we've seen, of course, white power extremists throughout the United States, as well as in Western Europe, kind of mobilized by white backlash and emboldened, especially by Donald Trump. And this is a global thing, right? Especially emboldened by Donald Trump in order to engage in the kind of hate violence that they've executed. We also see kind of more broadly trying to radicalize people and celebrating violence against women and minorities. We see, of course, the mobilization of kind of hate-based social movements, such as the English Defense League, which was a counter-jihad or an anti-Muslim social movement. But then, of course, most concerning is the kind of terrorist acts that we've seen over the last few years under Trump, and of course before that, which have targeted minorities, feminists, and leftists. And I think the storming of the Capitol is really the kind of the sort of one of the most extreme forms of mobilization that we've seen. So before we get into talking a little bit more about the Capitol, I just want to talk a little bit about social media. So one of the things that we've found kind of in the studies that I've done and that with colleagues is companies like Facebook, as much as it seems like they're trying to take action, have been pretty much instrumental in building the infrastructure needed for this idea of kind of white backlash to be exploited by the populist radical right and to contribute to that extreme mobilization. So for example, back in 2014, I collected a whole load of data on what kinds of things that what Britain First was saying and what their supporters were saying in the comments. And then they were growing exponentially. And at the time, in 2014, I was working with an NGO, and we went to Facebook and we said, you've got to do something about Britain First. They're growing a lot, and you've got to kind of nip this in the bud before it gets worse, right? And of course, Facebook basically smiled, said, we'll do what we can, and they basically did nothing. What we actually found out was that in the meantime, this came out in a report from a documentary done by Channel 4 in the UK. They found that actually for Britain First, which was another extreme right party, and particularly anti-Muslim one at that, Facebook was actually giving them special privileges that actually prevented them from facing content moderation and having their posts taken down. So that was what was going on up until about 2018, when Donald Trump retweeted Jada Franson, who's one of the key figures in Britain First, one of the key leaders, and then she later got arrested. So once Britain First got arrested, then Facebook took action. By that point, Britain First had almost 2 million followers. And then we found in 2019 that Britain First was still able to purchase another ad, just as long as they didn't call themselves Britain First. But they did use the name of Paul Golding, who was, of course, the leader of Britain First at the time. But it's really important that we understand that as much as this is a political development that's been driven by specific kinds of right-wing discourse, social media platforms turned a blind eye to this and did not act on it when they could have actually made a really big difference in limiting the spread of these racist ideas. This is a piece of a visualization and some analysis that I did for a report for the US Senate on Russian disinformation in the US. And what we found was that actually the platforms like Facebook, so this is still Facebook, was actually advertising, allowing a troll farm in St. Petersburg, Russia, to advertise racist content to users in the United States, right? So we've got this one about Barack Obama dressed up basically like a jihadist. But when I was actually doing the data analysis, what I found was that Facebook allows you, of course, to target people based on different kinds of interests that Facebook thinks that we have, based on all their collection of our data and the things that we like and all that kind of stuff, right? And what we actually found was that they were allowing the advertisers to go in and try to target people with, for example, patriotism behaviors or an interest in the National Rifle Association. But elsewhere, I found that in 4 instances, Facebook didn't take money for it, but in 4 instances, even the interest group white nationalism was something that Facebook allowed people to go and actually target ads for. So if Facebook thought you were interested in white nationalism and you were an advertiser trying to reach that particular group on their platform, you could actually try to target people based on that. Now, I mean, this really shows kind of how poorly platforms have been dealing with this problem. Nobody would have ever thought, and Facebook never did as far as I'm aware, allowed people to advertise to someone based on their interest in jihadism. But of course, we've seen actually that Facebook has enabled all this kind of racist advertising and even allowed people to use its kind of cutting edge technology in order to do that kind of work. So that brings us to this moment last week. So of course, I mean, what we had was for years, right, you had this development of this extreme right kind of networks online. They were spreading a huge amount of disinformation. Social media platforms were continuing to let this fester. And we didn't have any real robust response to this. Now, through kind of course, after the US election and before it, there is constantly this drip of the idea that the election was going to be rigged, fitting in with kind of ideas about trying to suppress specific kinds of voters. And then, of course, after the election, the idea was that there were all of this, of course, is nonsense, but that there were all kinds of voting irregularities. And so because Donald Trump, and of course, as well as the GOP, had been kind of feeding this disinformation to its supporters and to people all over the country, they had really set the stage for all of this. But the reason I wanted to take you through this kind of broader trajectory is because I think we really need to understand that this comes from a kind of like I said, a kind of symbolic repertoire that's been developed over the course of 4 to 5 years, in which kind of these, what others kind of refer to as kind of alternative realities kind of come into play. And what we've seen, and just to go back to this kind of theory here, is that this kind of close relationship between white backlash and far-right politicians working together, reinforcing and validating one another, sets the stage for the kinds of mobilization that we saw at the Capitol. So what we've seen is kind of coming out now, more kind of the information that we're getting now is kind of all of these different scenes of, for example, people feeling like people who attended the rally are now being put on no-fly lists, and feeling bad because they have been treated like a criminal or like a terrorist, thinking, of course, that because of who they are, they could never be identified as such. So what I want to say really here is that, kind of to finish off now, is that there's been this drip of disinformation, there's been this legitimation and validation of these racist ideas, and that's led us to the point in which Donald Trump was able to mobilize people so effectively by building constantly for 4 years on this white backlash rhetoric, and then bringing all those people to Washington and then launching them in this attack on the Capitol. So I hope that this talk, which was, of course, about this kind of this moment that we find ourselves in now in the last week, hasn't really been something that just happened or came out of the blue, but was really based on this kind of long-term, in the last 4 years, association between a particular kind of cultural formation, referring to, of course, the kind of ideas about white backlash that I've presented, with a political one, and how that can kind of quickly be used to then generate this kind of extreme violent mobilization. So I think I'll leave it there. I'm sure that there's plenty of other questions that you have, and I look forward to kind of speaking with all of you about that.
Yeah, thank you very much for that talk, and continuing going, but despite your interruption. I mean, as you can see, people don't always like us talking about such issues. We've had this happen before during a talk this summer with the Kai Week when we were discussing Black Lives Matter. So it's a consistent pattern, it seems, that, well, right-wing people invade Zoom calls. But yeah, we'll now move to a Q&A where Nina Valentini of Dispute Mancala, former Commissioner of Intellectual Activities of SIB, will be hosting it. And if you want to ask your questions, you can raise your hand and you can ask your questions yourself. I don't think we've had any further issues with the people in this audience. So letting you unmute yourself shouldn't be a problem. However, if you feel uncomfortable asking your questions yourself, or if you'd rather have me ask them for you, please do send any questions you have privately to me, and I will pass them on to Nina.
Yep, great, thank you. So yeah, as Matthias just said, if you have any question, please send them to him via Zoom, or feel free to already put your hand up now. And thank you already, Dr. Ganesh, for kind of just situating this in the broader content of what has been happening in the US, but I think also in various other parts of the world over the last couple of years. And yeah, while we're waiting for audience questions, I'm just going to start off with one, because you are obviously an assistant professor at the Media Studies Department, and you already talked a bit about content regulation and how holding social media platforms accountable hasn't really been effective so far. And yesterday I actually read an article that kind of characterized what happened at the US Capitol as the 9/11 moment of social media, kind of referring to how this is going to fundamentally change the way we perceive social media. And so my first question would be, do you agree with that? Is something going to change now with the way we approach social media and how it's going to be regulated? Or will that largely stay the same?
I don't know if I agree with the assessment that this is the 9/11 moment. I think that this is a bit bigger than social media, right? I mean, this is a very serious kind of compromising of the institutions of the state itself, right? Donald Trump got a crowd together, sent them to the Capitol, and actually disrupted a vote in Congress about certifying the election. So I mean, as a crisis, this is a lot bigger. Maybe this might be a watershed moment in terms of people actually taking white supremacist discourse and mobilization seriously. I don't know if it's necessarily going to do the same thing for social media. However, there's been, I would say, since Donald Trump was elected, there's started to become kind of like a lot of shifts in terms of the policing and regulation of social media. So this is something that I do some work on. And so for example, this kind of debate about deplatforming used to pretty much until from 2014, 2015, the only people that there was really a debate about deplatforming was really about people who were ISIS supporters, right? And so into 2016, into 2017, that started to change. But what we saw was that basically most of the ways in which the social media platforms tried to do it was so light touch that, for example, I showed you one particular influencer, Brittany Pettibone, who did a show with someone who's even more extreme named Tara McCarthy. And so in 2017, Twitter took down a bunch of accounts. It took down Tara McCarthy's account, but left Brittany Pettibone up, right? So it's like these two do radio shows together on YouTube. I guess not really radio shows, but they do YouTube shows together, right? But the platform's approach has been pretty ineffective. And I think actually, I would say that that was a political choice on the part of the platforms. They've been towing this line, which is let's not do too much because we don't want to anger the far right who use our services extensively. And so what we've seen is basically the application of double standards across the field here. I think maybe we have a moment to point out those double standards and to actually shift the debate. But also in terms of like the broader kind of trends about content regulation online, these discussions have been happening for a couple of years. So I think the article you're referring to was in Politico, right? Yeah. So I think that they were referring to also the EU content regulation. Now that's been brewing for a couple of years now. So I think that, you know, it's one thing to say that maybe this is a watershed moment for how we think about social media, but I think it's more of a watershed moment for how we understand the threat of the far right today. And I think that social media is going to become more and more, of course, a part of that discussion. But I don't think that this is like a watershed moment in that sense.
Okay, thank you. Then we have our first audience question from Aicha. I think you're still muted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
So first of all, thank you for your lecture. I think it was very informative. And my question is about Trump's Twitter account being banned and also other social media platforms. And I was wondering, what do you think will be the reaction from the populist radical right? Do you think they will interpret it as their freedom of expression being limited and that it would produce more backlash? Or would it be actually like a good step in like stopping this hate that is spreading over social media? So do you think Twitter actually helps this discussion, or do you think it's going to produce more backlash when what they did with Trump's account?
So I'm not a person who loves equations or statistics for that matter. But I do think that we can kind of think about this as a balancing equation, right? So you've got, let's forget about Trump for a second. You've got a person who is spreading hate on a platform, right? Now you have the thought, okay, am I going to take them down or do I let them continue, right? Do I take them down as a user also, or do I take down their posts? That's another question, right? And there's a cost benefit every time you got to think about this, right? You take someone down, that means they're off Twitter, which means, or they're off Facebook, which means they no longer have access to a really broad network, which is usually what they want because one, that helps them get their ideas across, right? It helps them target their ideas to people who don't already agree with them. And three, it also helps them make money, right? So it's an important funding instrument. So those are the benefits, right? Because if you can take someone out of a network, right, then you can reduce their ability to spread hate. We know that this works. You can reduce their ability to make money, which is something you want to do when people are using extremist ideologies to do so. And you make it harder for them to mainstream and validate their ideas. So there's a lot of benefits to doing this kind of thing. On the flip side, of course, we know for a fact that also once you take this kind of action, people double down their kind of intensity with which they feel a kind of belonging or kind of have this fidelity towards the views that they have. So what you want to do is you really got to balance this out. Now, my view on this is that one, the evidence shows us that deplatforming tends to work, that it reduces overall the amount of hate in a particular environment, and that we should pursue it, and that we shouldn't say, oh, we're going to drive conversations underground and it's going to be harder to monitor and all that kind of thing. Now, I think that primarily comes from people, academics and researchers and others who have a sense of like, oh, once it goes underground, then we're not going to be able to challenge those ideas. But we know for a fact that actually like challenging the ideas hasn't really worked that well. So what we might want to think about is, are we maintaining a taboo against the use of hate, against the use of tolerance in the mainstream spaces that we have? I think that is a valid mission. Now, when it comes to sort of what are the risks here, right? Well, people move off of Twitter and then go to some place like Parler or Gab, right? That reduces their ability to reach the people that they actually want to reach, right? Because if you go to a place like Gab, which is basically just for far right people, you're not really going to be engaging in the kind of political work that you want to do, which is changing opinions. So that's like at a theoretical level or broader level, what my take on deplatforming is. Now, if we look at the Trump question, I was pretty surprised when Twitter did it. I do think it was the right decision because the guy instigated an insurrection and a mob on the US Capitol building, right? Like that is a certain point at which that kind of activity is unacceptable. But for me, what really angers me is that these platforms wait until this happens before they act. Now, with the president of the United States, you kind of have to wait before you can act. I get that, right? But with the hundreds of anti-Muslim activists that have been using Twitter for years that they never did anything about, with groups like Britain First that took years for Facebook to ever kind of start addressing the problem, right? I mean, like this is a much bigger kind of environment. And the fact that these platforms have been so permissive about hate speech over the course of the last 4 to 5 years, I think is really what led us to this point, right? So, we're putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. But yeah, I mean, taking down Donald Trump is something that had to be done simply because, he violated some pretty fundamental beliefs about the principles about the rule of law. When it comes to a platform like Parler, for example, I think things get a little bit more hazy. Right? Because it's harder to deplatform a website. But the way that's done, of course, is by like Amazon, Google, Apple deciding, okay, we're going to take this off of our device stores. Amazon decides, okay, we're no longer going to provide server hosting. Companies like Cloudflare and GoDaddy have done this for other extreme right groups in the past. And again, I think that actually, even if it does kind of increase the amount of intensity and fervor by which certain people hold their beliefs, I think doing that is important because it's more important to maintain the taboos and the idea that these kinds of behaviors are unacceptable. And sending that message, I think, is more important than worrying about where they're going to go underground. They're constantly going to find another place to migrate to. And it's our job as researchers or as investigators to understand what they're doing in those new places. Right. But I think it's actually kind of like a quarantine strategy in the sense of like you start pushing people to darker corners, more underground corners of the internet. Yes, maybe the risk of missing something is higher, but it also prevents them from doing the very thing that they really, really crave, which is being able to influence mainstream discussions and spread disinformation across large networks.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to hear that this deplatforming actually works. Let's continue with Alan.
Okay, yeah, sorry, with the forced muting thing, I was kind of lost. No, I just want to ask because I think at least in the last 4 years, the Republican Party mainly, but different parties have discovered that kind of adopting this type of rhetoric and this type of discourse actually brings them votes in a sense, or at least brings them one type of electorate. Do you think that now with Trump going out in the US, it will, like this type of rhetoric will diminish and the Republican Party might go back to a more moderate position, or do you think they will be able to actually, or will they not give up that part of electorate and still continue, and this type of rhetoric will still be as present as it is right now in the political and news sphere in the US? That's
a very good question. I I don't know enough to make a kind of prediction on where the Republican Party is going to go. I think there's sort of a couple paths we might want to keep in mind. So the first one is the Republican Party realizes, okay, we've got one really good way of mobilizing our base, and we can see how effective it is. And I think they're going to keep trying to push that line. So I do think that this kind of politics of white identity is not going anywhere. That's going to still be really, really crucial. But you said, will the Republican Party go back to a more moderate position? Now, there's a lot of there were a lot of moderates in the Republican Party. That is diminishing, but I would make the claim that at least since Nixon, right? I mean, representing middle-class white identity and this kind of politics of white identity under threat after the civil rights era has been a fundamental aspect of what the Republican Party has been doing, right? It's gotten a lot worse, especially since 2008, because that's how a lot of this was mobilized, right? Than what we see today. But I'm not trying to suggest that everybody in the Republican Party is a right-wing extremist. That's nonsense. But we've seen that over and over and over again, the people running for president in the Republican Party, the voices that seem to be the loudest in terms of supporting Trump, for example, have recognized the potential of mobilizing white backlash to win votes. So I don't think that that's going to go away. The problem is that raises a pretty serious strategic issue for the Republican Party, right? Because if you're only speaking to one group in a really diverse country in which more and more minorities are coming out to vote, that really limits your electoral potential, right? So I think that what the Republican Party is, so this is a prediction, but don't take too much in stock with it. My intuition is that the Republican Party will probably double down its efforts in voter suppression and do its best, especially with its Republican governors and its the states that it controls, in order to draw congressional districts such that they can maintain using this white backlash and white identity politics as long as they can. So I think that's what's going to happen, and as long as they think that that's sustainable, they're going to keep doing that. But I think that this represents, in this sense, a kind of what is going to sustain the Republican Party after the US becomes more diverse, after more minorities and non-white people start taking up and using their power to vote. That's really going to shift the calculus. I don't expect that the Republican Party is going to have an answer to this question for quite some time, and I don't think they're going to gain much ground with minorities. Though, Trump did succeed with some small segments, particularly among men, amongst minorities, but they're not hugely significant sectors. So I think that a third layer onto this, right, is that the Republican Party is going to be starting to think about, okay, well, how do we maintain the kinds of power structures that we're interested in, but try not to put such an obvious kind of white identity politics branding on it. I think what you're going to see is kind of more attempts at laundering these kinds of ideas coming out of the GOP in the next few years.
Quite interesting. So kind of the mentality will stay the same, but the strategies might change.
Again, time will probably prove me wrong. I hope it does, but this is my intuition, so don't take it too seriously.
We'll see. Yeah, I think we can take one last question by Anna.
Thank you. Thank you for your great lecture. I would like to ask, maybe in a different direction, what are the main differences in how the far left and the far right utilize social media platforms, and how do you explain those? And added to that, why does the far right seem to be so much more successful in the Western world in utilizing social media platforms? Is it just due to size, or are there other factors at play?
Okay. In terms of how the far left uses social media platforms, it's not an area I've done a lot of research into, so it's not something I know a whole lot about. But I think one of the things we need to understand. So one is I want to push against the idea of talking far right, far left, right? That's not to suggest that both sides of that doesn't exist, or that there isn't a far left, or that there isn't a militant part of the left that doesn't have a place in democratic systems. There's some, right? But it's a minuscule part of the left. It's not, whatever the kind of mainstream reference to far left is usually not referring to anti-democratic ideas, whereas far right is definitively based in anti-democratic ideas. Now, when it comes to kind of your question about what are the differences in social media, right? So, for example, the center left, especially with Barack Obama, was highly successful in using and mobilizing audiences and getting people out to vote by using social media. So in this sense, a lot of the innovation in terms of political communication around social media draws from those lessons learned by the Obama campaign. But then what happened when Trump ran for election, and this is covered by a really brilliant book. I can't remember the name now, but it was, I think it's called The Long Revolution. I can't remember, by Jen Schrady at Sciences Po. And in it, what she talks about, she makes a really good case for it, is the community organizing that the Republican Party had in the United States was really good at connecting the social media aspects and the broader media landscape. We shouldn't forget about broadcasts like Fox News. We shouldn't forget about, just regular old television and radio. But they were really good at bringing those together and making it work with kind of with communities on the ground, right? So in that sense, the Republican Party was really had built a really good campaigning infrastructure to get their ideas out and to get people mobilized. On top of that, what you've also had is on top of that, you kind of have also, you have the Republican Party already has a really good organizing system, as I've said. But on top of that, you had a lot of research and development in terms of digital marketing and digital strategy. And so there's a lot of kind of key players in sort of the Trump campaign and the tech industry that kind of came together around kind of doing effective online campaigning. So you've got the most important piece of this is that the Republicans had that infrastructure, which was, the kind of normal, regular old kind of political infrastructure you need to build to get people mobilized and get people out to vote, right? On top of that, you had this very kind of effective decentralized strategy of getting people who are really passionate about these particular issues, who are engaged in these kinds of extreme politics, to start spreading memes on social media, to start spreading these ideas on social media, which then helped amplify that message, right? So you have a lot of, it's really a confluence of factors. I don't know if it's so much that the right is way better at doing social media than the left, more than it is the right had a much better communications apparatus that was primed to then go and take advantage of this particular situation. I hope that kind of answers your question.
I hope so too. And I think with that, I will end the Q&A. Thank you very much, Dr. Ganesh, for joining us and answering those questions. I hope everyone was satisfied with their answers.